What's going on, everybody? Today I'm talking about my 10 favorite players to look out for in this upcoming college football season. It's important to note that this isn't the top 10 players in college football, although a few of them do fall on that list. This is more so the 10 players to look out for because we've seen them play great football, but they could take that next step into being an elite player in college football, or we already know they're great and we don't know just how high their ceiling is. So this is my 10 favorite players that I'm keeping a lookout for in this upcoming season, and I think that you should as well. And the first one I'm going to talk about is tight end Michael Mayer for Notre Dame. Former five-star, had a fantastic season last year, over 840 yards and 7 touchdowns, which as a tight end isn't particularly easy to do. The guy's more like Michael Myers, okay? He's a phenomenal athlete. Kind of looks like Rob Gronkowski out there, if I'm being honest. And we saw him have some huge games against Stanford, Florida State, a 2-touchdown game against Oklahoma State at the end of the year. He's physically dominant and one of the top players in college football. To me, I think he's a better prospect than, say, a TJ Hawkinson, who got drafted 9th overall. So that's not to say he's going to go higher than TJ Hawkinson did a few years ago in the draft, but he's going to be getting drafted very high in the NFL and will probably be an All-American this season. So watch out for Michael Mayer because based on the year he had last season, it's possible for him to do even better this season. And he's probably the best player on Notre Dame's roster, if you ask me. My 9th player to watch for is Devin Leary, quarterback for NC State. 35-5 touchdown interception ratio last season. And it's not like he just beat up on bad teams in the ACC last year. Take a look at his game against Clemson. Clemson had one of the best defensive lines, really the best front sevens in the country last year, and he still played a near perfect performance, 72% completion percentage in that game, and 4 touchdowns. And sure, Clemson wasn't overall as good a team as they have been in the last 4 or 5 years, but their defense was still phenomenal last year. And Devin Leary played a perfect game, beating them in double overtime. And he had multiple 4-touchdown performances. He had 5 games last season with 4 touchdowns. And NC State returns the majority of their starters from last season as well. Losing a couple big names on offense, but overall NC State's primed for a huge year. And the main reason why you see NC State getting so much of that, borderline top 10 attention is because of Devin Leary coming back for another year. But the question is, will he be a Sam Howell for North Carolina last season and, the team regresses with some of those losses that they have, like Akeem Ekwonu at tackle, for example? Or will he walk into his senior season? He's got another year of eligibility, but his senior season, his 4th year with the program, and take that big step and start to get talked about like a potential first-round quarterback into the NFL draft? Because Devin Leary is a stud. He's not the most impressive physically, but he's got a phenomenal arm, and I think he can make pretty much every throw on the field. So my 8th player, Bijan Robinson, running back, Texas. You're talking about a guy that averaged 8.2 yards per carry as a freshman at Texas. He's in his junior season, his 3rd year. You've got Quinn Ewers at quarterback, Xavier Worthy at wide receiver, and Bijan Robinson finishes that trio of phenomenal offensive talent that Texas has. Now, they've got the injury bug a little bit at Texas lately, but he's still primed for a big year, and he's viewed as one of the top running backs in the country heading into this season. He only has 281 total carries in his first 2 years. But if you see that number go up to 225, 230 this season, Bijan Robinson could have a really impressive season statistically and help Texas try and come back and be competitive in the Big 12. I've got my eye on Texas, and a big reason for that is Bijan Robinson, who's probably the best running back in the country heading into this upcoming season. My next player, I've got Jordan Addison. Jordan Addison blew up in that offensive system that Pitt had last season. 100 catches, 1,500 yards. She almost had 1,600 yards and a whopping 17 receiving touchdowns. Catching the ball from Kenny Pickett. Ended up being the only first-round quarterback in the draft. However, Pitt loses their offensive coordinator. They lose Kenny Pickett to the draft. Jordan Addison hits a transfer portal. He is now at the University of SoCal with Lincoln Riley at head coach, offensive mastermind, and Caleb Williams at quarterback. So Jordan Addison is primed for another huge season. And he had some disgusting performances last year. 200 yards and 4 touchdowns against Virginia, 170 yards and a touchdown against Duke. And even without Kenny Pickett, he still had a 7-catch, 114-yard performance against Michigan State in their bowl game last year. But with those changes at Pitt and with the potential that USC ends up transferring over there, and he's primed to be one of the most productive wide receivers in college football. Like, you can go back and look at the number one wide receivers in Lincoln Riley's offenses at Oklahoma, and they're productive. So they're going to spread the ball out more there than I think they did at Pitt, but Jordan Addison's still primed to potentially break that 1,400-yard and most certainly that double-digit mark. He is going to be a very productive wide receiver this year. Probably a Biletnikoff finalist again. Next up, a player most people probably aren't following, but linebacker Jack Campbell for Iowa. And the reason I bring up Jack Campbell instead of some other linebackers is because he made the surprising decision to return to Iowa for his senior season. He had 140 total tackles last year. He's just an absolute tackling machine in the Big Ten with a lot of run-heavy teams, and I expect him to do that again. The total number of tackles that this guy will rack up in his time at Iowa is going to be absolutely ridiculous. It's something you saw happen more often in like the 80s and 90s when you had so many run-heavy teams and guys stayed in college football for 4 years, but it doesn't happen as often now, so I think it would be awesome to see him rack up another 140 tackle season for Iowa this year. He's going to lead the way for another great defense, and he's an Iowa-born guy playing for the Hawkeyes, and he is one of the top linebackers in the Big Ten and the country. So keep an eye out for Jack Campbell because he's primed to have another big season for them. Now, I'm cheating a little bit with this one, but I'm going with the Clemson defensive line because they, by a mile, have the best defensive line in college football this season. And the reason I bring that up is because, again, their struggles last year weren't defensive. It was because of their offense. New offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator for Clemson this season, and their defense is going to be just as good. It could be on par with that of like what Georgia had last year when they went on their national championship run. Myles Murphy's a former 5-star. Brian Brees is a former 5-star. In total, I see 4 5-stars that could be on the field on the defensive line for them. KJ Henry's another one, a rotational guy for them off the end. Their front 7 as a whole is fantastic, but their defensive line is phenomenal. And just with how Georgia made their national championship run last year and the importance of their defensive line, I'm not saying Clemson will go on a national championship run. We have to kind of see it to believe it with new coordinators there. We've seen Clemson win 2 national championships with Dabo Swinney, but there are some changes going on. The quarterback position's a little in question. You're always at risk with a defensive line as good as theirs. So watch out for that Clemson defensive line this season and see if it takes over in a way that Georgia's did last year. And speaking of Georgia, I've got a Bulldog I want to talk about. Brock Bowers, tight end for the Georgia Bulldogs. As an 18-year-old freshman last year, racked up over 880 yards and 13 touchdowns on the national championship winning Georgia Bulldogs team. He had 139 yards and a touchdown against Alabama in the SEC championship game as a freshman. That's just something you don't see tight ends do. There's a video of him out there, I think against Alabama, where he shrugs off like 4 defenders on his way to a touchdown. I watched him have a nice 55-yard touchdown performance against Michigan. He had a disgusting 100 yards and 2 touchdowns off of just 3 catches against Georgia Tech. The guy's a monster, and he's again going to be the focal point for their passing attack this upcoming season. Stetson Bennett's going to be out there again at quarterback, so I expect Brock Bowers to have another great season as a sophomore tight end. And the ceiling that he has is through the roof. So definitely watch out for Brock Bowers, who's just going to keep getting better this year and next year. The third player I'm going to talk about, Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, this is another example where it's like, we know how great this player is, but we'll see just how great they can be. He had 2 future first-round wide receivers last season that were playing around him at wide receiver, Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. He was still a very productive receiver for Ohio State. But when those 2 guys were gone for the Rose Bowl against Utah, he went off for over 347 yards and 3 touchdowns on 15 catches. One of the best Rose Bowl performances I've ever seen from an individual player. He dominated Utah and kind of single-handedly won them that game. I mean, C.J. Stroud had a lot to do with it, slinging the rock himself, but Jackson Smith's domination of Utah was terrifying, and it could be a sign of things to come with him now being the primary wide receiver for Ohio State, who brings back C.J. Stroud, who was a Heisman finalist quarterback last year. So Jackson Smith and Jibba, it's kind of scary to think about just how good he could be, being the number one wide receiver. And there's former 5-stars around him. Ohio State has a great wide receiver room. It's just he's now the guy for them and is becoming a lock to be a top 5 pick in the next NFL draft. Next up is Alabama edge rusher, not Will Anderson, but Dallas Turner. And the reason I'm talking about Turner, former 5-star, he had 8.5 sacks last season, and he didn't register a sack until November 6th against LSU, when he had a 2-sack performance. He's now a sophomore. He has an incredible edge rusher opposite of him in the form of Will Anderson. Dallas Turner certainly benefits from having Will Anderson opposite of him. But Alabama has the best edge rush duo in college football, not only because of Will Anderson, but also because of Dallas Turner. Dallas Turner as a freshman having 8.5 sacks is really impressive. And now he's out here as a sophomore. He's going to be even better. It's going to be so hard to throw the football against Alabama when you have, again, not only Will Anderson, but Dallas Turner opposite of him. Dallas Turner, I think, is what makes that linebacking core special for Alabama. Because it's like with Michigan last season. Yes, Aiden Hutchinson was the guy for them last year. But what made them such a dominant edge rushing duo was having David Ojabo as well. Now you've got Dallas Turner. He could end up being one of the best edge rushers in college football the next couple seasons with the potential that he has. And finally, I'm going to talk about Caleb Wilson, quarterback, USC, transferred over and followed Lincoln Riley to Oklahoma after Caleb Williams took over in a very difficult spot. I remember watching that Texas-Oklahoma game. Oklahoma was down bad against Texas. Spencer Rattler had been playing subpar football against subpar teams up until that point. He wasn't getting it done against Texas. They put Caleb Williams in, and it's an instant shift offensively. Considering he stepped in late into the season and being only a freshman, he still had 1,900 yards and 21 touchdowns, not to mention his 440 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. We've seen Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma have Heisman-winning quarterback in Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, and I truly believe Caleb Williams could be a Heisman winner at USC. I talked about Jordan Addison earlier, who is now also at USC, and more. Like, they utilized the transfer portal, retained the talent that USC had that they liked. USC could be very, very good this year, mostly because of former 5-star Caleb Williams. He's an incredible player who, and if you can kind of tell, these young players, these freshmen and sophomores that dominate, are pretty much littered across this list. Because now as a sophomore, Caleb Williams really has a shot to compete for a Heisman and try to take USC to the playoff, which is a little bit of an aggressive team prediction, but offensively I don't see why USC can't be fantastic. Their offensive line should be good, maybe not great, but good. He's got great receivers to catch the ball, great head coach in the form of Lincoln Riley to help him succeed. Caleb Williams could be one of the top quarterbacks in college football. So with that said, those are my 10 top players to watch this upcoming season. A few honorable mentions that didn't quite make the top 10. Kayshon Boutte for LSU. He's been productive no matter who he's had at quarterback. And he's been limited a little bit by injury. But just this year for him is just, you got a new head coach in Brian Kelly and another quarterback. I'm just not sure how that's all going to unfold for him. I don't doubt that he's still going to be great. Because like I said, he's been productive no matter who's been throwing him the football. But that does worry me a little bit. It doesn't quite elevate him to the levels of like Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith, and Jibba. I included one positional group on here, the Clemson defensive line. So I didn't want to include another. But the Michigan offensive line, I want to talk about it in a similar light. They bring back 3 of 5 starters. They were awarded best offensive line in the country last season. And yes, they didn't look as great against Georgia. But you're also talking about the best defense in the country last season in the form of Georgia. And one of the best defensive lines we've ever seen. So a little unfair to gauge Michigan's offensive line off of that one game. But they were a phenomenal offensive line last year. They returned 3 out of 5 starters. Oluwatimi comes in, transfer from Virginia to replace Andrew Vastardes at center. So they could upgrade the offensive line like from last season. Their offensive line could be even better. Could they be the first 2-time Joe Moore Award for best offensive line? We'll see. I kind of doubt it. I don't think they're going to be as run heavy this year, but the offensive line is still going to be great, if not better than it was last season. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. So with that said, those are the top 10 players I'm following this season, and I think you should follow them as well if you're a college football fanatic. It's going to be entertaining football to watch. They're going to really influence their respective draft classes that they end up going in, and I think they're going to be statistical freaks. So those are the 10 players I'm watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. It helps grow my channel. Let me know what players you're following, whether it's for your team or another team this upcoming season. And I can't wait for college football to start in just a few short days.